2015 draft general plan and receipt of public comments.
George, you're on.
Good morning, sir.
Morning.
This is our fourth workshop in relation to the general plan. What we were trying to do with the previous three workshops is to work our way through the plan from beginning to end, identify anything that you wanted to see changed, and bring all of that back to you for today's meeting to discuss it where necessary or to show it to you where it was appropriate. So one of the things that we did for you was to provide you with a copy of the plan that has a drafted date at the bottom left that says April 7th, today's date. That plan should be the one that's on the city website as well as the one that you received prior to this meeting for you to take a look at. It shows in the text with strike-throughs and underlines what was changed as a result of your discussions during the first three workshop meetings. And then there were a number of items that you requested we bring back as discussion items for you to determine whether you wanted to include them in the plan or not include them in the plan. Or in one case, it was a matter of specifically discussing an interpretation of description of wildland-urban interface. So I'll hit that one too as we talk. We also have a number of proposed adds onto the plan. Primarily they're map changes to the plan, and we'll talk about those with you as well. There are two changes to the land use map that are probably worth a discussion on your part and a determination whether to include them at this time or not. And then there is a minor change that we made to the jurisdictional map that you requested, where we show the jurisdictional boundary that we've agreed to for annexation purposes with Prescott Valley. So that map also is before you. You have copies of an 11 by 17 sized maps. They're a little bit easier to read, and I apologize. The larger maps can be printed, and we certainly will have larger maps for any public discussion that may occur in the future, and we can post those larger maps. The maps are all online on the city's website as PDF files. Anyone interested in them can look at them online and zoom into any particular area on the map to get a clear view of those areas that they may have an interest in. So that's one option. And if they have questions based on that, anyone from the public is certainly welcome to come and visit us, and we can go into specific detail with those zoomed in areas, if you will. For staff's presentation this morning, if it is acceptable to council, I will not go through page by page with all of the strike-throughs and underlines. If you have a specific area you'd like to talk about, please bring it up. We'll flip to that page, put it up on the screen, and have your discussion. Otherwise, what we would like to do this morning is to talk about those particular areas that you ask us to bring information back to you, and the map changes that are proposed. And then at the end of the staff part of this discussion, it would be appropriate to open the public hearing. This is set for a public hearing today, as well as for your meeting on the 14th, in order to allow the maximum public input into this process. We have both today and the 14th set for public hearings.
George, just a question.
Sir.
The public hearing, are you saying that there is still the possibility that there could be changes to the general plan after the April 14th input from the public?
The process established by state law allows for public comment and input through the end of the public hearing on the 14th. It's through the end of the public hearing on the day that you're expected to adopt the plan. If changes are made, and as a result of receiving good public comment and this council wants to adopt those changes, then we will revise the document and repost it. But council's action on the 14th could be to adopt the plan as amended, and then it will be up to staff to make sure that that's reflected in the documentation and published.
Okay,
So,
any other
yes.
questions on that from anybody?
Sure.
It's okay.
So the first item that was discussed during the process that was requested to be brought back to you was a discussion of form-based codes. It was something that the General Plan Committee inserted into the document following the lead of staff, who had looked at the possibility some 2 or 3 years ago of bringing that forward. In fact, I believe council at the time had a presentation by planning director from Flagstaff on the benefits of form-based codes. Following that presentation, staff drafted some basic information, and as a result of that basic information, the General Plan Committee suggested that it be offered as an opportunity. It's something that allows additional flexibility that a developer could choose to adopt if they wanted to. Our current process, current land development code, is very specific. It's very traditional zoning, districts control uses. It has nothing to do with the form or look or size or scale of the project. The form-based code process would allow for a change in that in specific areas, and it would require that a particular area in town be designated to allow that form-based code. So a developer wanting to do it would come to council and say, I would like to have my 35 acres or 50 acres of property designated as form-based code. And then they would come back to you with a form-based code plan that would show what they would propose to be the scale and street widths and building sizes and setbacks and those types of things that control the safety issues, and present that to you, and through an interactive process you would adopt it for that particular area. So it's a very site-specific program. If that were to happen, that area would sort of be withdrawn from our standard zoning districts. It wouldn't fall under the zoning categories that you would typically have apply. You wouldn't worry necessarily about the uses that were proposed or compatibility between uses within a district, which is primarily what traditional zoning does. It tries to separate uses that are incompatible from each other. The form-based code approach would allow you to say, well, we like this look of buildings. And again, it is at the developer or property owner's discretion to propose that to you. It's his control over what happens to the property rather than standard zoning control over what happens to the property. The Land Development Code has several zoning districts that are very flexible, and we have an overlay called a planned area development that's also very flexible. And it was the belief expressed by the Planning Commission, primarily the Planning Commission chair, that it was unnecessary to offer up the form-based code concept. And the Planning Commission adopted the plan draft that was presented to council with all of the references to form-based code withdrawn. As a result of some discussion at our first workshop, you requested that we bring back enough information for you to decide whether to reintroduce it into the general plan. So that's sort of a synopsis of what happened and why it's here, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have about what's involved in a form-based code concept, but I do know that that was one of the flexibility options that you wanted to discuss further. So with that, I'll open to any questions or comments you have.
I think you've answered all my questions about it, George. Thank you.
Yeah.
If it's council's desire to reinsert it into the plan, we've offered a location, goal, strategy associated with that. We just need your consensus or acknowledgement that that's what you'd like us to do, and we will have that back in the draft that you'll have available on the 14th.
Anyone?
Sounds good to me.
Very good. Thank you.
Leave it alone.
There was some discussion of a countywide housing authority brought up at the second workshop meeting. I believe Lindsay Bell, who is here in the audience, brought that before you and offered up that a housing authority controlled at a local level, like within a particular community, Prescott or Prescott Valley or Chino Valley, has very limited ability to affect housing throughout the area because we have so much interactivity of housing in certain areas and employment in other areas. People who work here don't live here. They don't have to live here. There are so many other areas in close proximity that it's sort of a spider web of connectivity. A county-wide housing authority would be able to affect an area, and it could be focused on particular metropolitan areas such as the Prescott area, through activities with other outside agencies that provide for housing funding. It could provide grant funding, for instance. It can acquire grant funding. It could operate in a manner relating to housing somewhat like SIMPO operates in a manner relating to traffic and development of our circulation infrastructure. They would be able to address those things that would not be within the scope or reach of a particular local community. So one of the options that was proposed is to bring back some language that would put a recommendation into the plan that the city encourage pursuit of such an activity at the county level. So we've done that with the language that's shown on the plan, shown on the screen above. And Lindsay is here, and perhaps a question for her would be more appropriate, allowing her to include some additional language if necessary.
Okay. Lindsay, normally we wait till the end, but because this is something you were interested in, you want to comment on it?
Actually, the idea for a housing authority was something that I brought forward on behalf of a group of advocates in the community who have been working on housing and homeless issues for a while. The coalition of agencies is led by Prescott Area Shelter Services, and they've spent the last couple of years looking at a wide range of poverty issues, but particularly how housing and the lack of affordable housing for rental or for purchase affects people's ability to lift themselves out of a poverty cycle. And after doing a lot of study and surveys and research into the problems, they've come up with the idea of doing a county-wide housing authority, which would be a vehicle that would allow federal housing funds to come into the community, and they specifically didn't suggest that it be attached to a single jurisdiction because the need is across the county. And to set up housing authority, there are some administrative costs. So it doesn't make much sense for an individual jurisdiction to do it, that it should have a wider scope of authority. 10 years ago, when we did the 2003 general plan, we had the same discussion about whether there was a need for a housing authority or not. And at that time, the committee recommended against it, again because of the administrative costs and so forth. And at the time, there was a statewide housing agency that was connected with the State Department of Housing, which served in that same function, that could bring to a rural county or any place in the state the same funds, the federal housing funds, to bear. But in recent years, that hasn't been very effective, and so the net result is that Yavapai County gets very few of those housing dollars, things like Section 8 vouchers and so forth that will help subsidize the cost of rental housing and so forth. So with that change at the state level and that vehicle not being available to us, the local advocates came around to, we need a county-wide housing authority.
Mayor?
Sure.
So you'd set up a board, a county-wide board. Would that have elected representation on that board, or would that just be representation from, like, handpicked by the advocates?
I think the way that it's set up is it's actually set up as a nonprofit corporation for the purposes of housing development. It doesn't necessarily have to be under the auspices of, like, the city of Prescott or whatever.
And George, would setting up a county-wide group preempt Prescott's ability to chart its own course?
No. I think one of the key things that would have to occur through this process, and Lindsay just mentioned that, is that it's separate from government. It would be its own not-for-profit organization that would have countywide jurisdiction. The role of the city, based on the information that we provided to you for the general plan, is simply to promote it and to participate wherever possible in it. And participation could be as simple as assisting them with zoning changes or helping them with locations that may be available that might have infrastructure needs that they could come to the city and ask for infrastructure plans to be reordered in order to help them. Very similar to what we do with much more focused groups like Habitat. We already deal with Habitat on a regular basis for issues that are associated with their development, and we try to assist them in making that happen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Anyone else?
Mayor, just to follow up, I think it's reasonable to include it in the plan. My expectation is that if we start to see the workforce base grow over the next 10 years, a housing authority of some nature is going to be needed. You know, we already have people walking in to City Hall on a pretty regular basis asking for where to go, what assistance is available, so I've got no issue including it.
I'd like to see it included. I've lived in communities where there have been housing authorities, and they have set up very successful apartment, single-family projects. I think there's a misperception that they tend to create slums and draw the wrong kind of people, but actually housing authorities have very strict rules. No drugs, no alcohol abuse, that kind of thing. And they can be made into great people environments. So I think it's a good opportunity to have.
Thank you, Councilwoman. And I would point out that not all of the housing grants go for congregate housing types like an apartment complex or something. Section 8 vouchers, for example, can be given to an individual person who's eligible to rent a single-family house. So it's not all congregate housing that we're talking about. It's a wide range of opportunities. One of the things that business community and developers are kind of interested in are tax credit projects. We do have some of those tax credit projects in this area, several of them out in Prescott Valley, and I think a couple in Chino Valley too. This housing authority could facilitate more of those as well.
Anyone else?
I'll make a comment on it. I don't have a problem including a somewhat non-specific strategy. I mean, as far as encouraging, that's non-specific. This is not a strategic plan. It's a general plan. And I would look at this somewhat similar to a county-wide health department. I mean, we don't have a citywide health department. We have a county-wide health department. So I think that it makes sense to have that in a general plan, that we would encourage it. That doesn't mean we take the lead in it. This means we're encouraging it. So I don't have a problem with it.
That pretty much parallels my thoughts. I mentioned this briefly to two of the supervisors, because when you say county-wide, the first implication is that we are the city of Prescott in our general plan, that we're making a recommendation that the county should be doing something that they haven't. So I think the language is what's important here, that if an opportunity presented itself, we could certainly, whatever council is in effect at that time, could take a look at it and encourage it or discourage it. But I think the language is critical, that the city of Prescott in our general plan is not trying to tell the county that they should take the lead in a countywide plan. Anyway, welcome home. You're a little peaked. How you?
I'm okay.
Okay.
I'm here.
Welcome back. Okay. Anyone else? So does that give you enough, George, to?
I believe it does, yes, sir. One of the things that we tried to do in proposing the strategy is to make it general support the creation of a countywide housing authority. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's an arm of the county. Again, a private nonprofit group is probably more effective at doing this than a local government would be.
Okay. Lindsay, thank you. Okay, George, go ahead.
Oh, one other issue came up during the discussion that you asked us to bring something back to you on, and that was the definition of wildland-urban interface. The definition we were using was an older one that did not match up with the current wildland-urban interface code that the city adopted. In fact, you adopted the latest version of that in January with the 2012 building and fire codes. So we've pulled out the specific definition out of that interface code and inserted it in here for consistency across the board.
Any comments on that one?
George, I appreciate you taking a look at that and changing the language. I think one of the things I'm trying to get across with this change specifically is the scope in which Prescott is in the wildland-urban interface. If you take a look at the map that's been provided by the fire department, that interface goes fairly deep into the center of town. And so what I'm looking for is something where someone can easily read this and understand that the wildland-urban interface is a major component to a large portion of the city of Prescott. And I think this gets there, but it still leaves, this is a very official type statement. And I don't know that it's broad enough to really incorporate everything related to wildland-urban interface.
Would it be more effective if we added the wildland-urban interface map as an addendum to the general plan rather than try to explain it in text, show, and...
That would be acceptable. If you would reference that it's an addendum to the plan and put it in there, I think that'd be appropriate.
Very good. That's easy to do.
Thank you.
Chris, you okay?
Yep, good.
Steve, okay?
I'm good, yeah.
Jean?
Fine.
Okay.
So as I mentioned earlier, we gave you some 11 by 17 sized maps out of the plan. Those maps are modified in two cases per discussion at your previous workshops. The land use map shows any city-owned properties that were acquired for the purpose of open space as open space, and those are reflected on the map. I don't have an overhead for that one. We also added to the regional jurisdiction map the boundary line that we agreed for annexation purposes with Prescott Valley. So that's identified on the map in a very bright manner. We made a minor change to the circulation map, removing a portion of Williamson Valley Road that had previously been identified for widening that is no longer identified for widening, so that was pulled off of the map. Again, we're looking at future efforts. These maps are intended to show what will happen, so we pulled that off. The other changes are associated with the land use map, and I do have some overheads of those. Since the adoption and recommendation by Planning Commission of the draft plan to send to you, there were two proposals made to modify the land use map. And that modification can occur with council's approval and incorporation into this version of the plan that will go to the voters, and that constitutes a legitimate map amendment through the state process. One of the requests was by a company called Arizona Eco Development, and we do have a representative here who can talk a little bit about this proposal to make some modifications to the land use designations for two particular areas, and I'm going to show them to you in isolation first, and then we'll talk about them on the actual map. For reference purposes, you see 89A. You also see, if you're familiar with the city's corporate boundary, there's an odd notch right here where we have our airport wastewater treatment plant. That area is primarily off the end of the runway. It's wide open space at the moment. There's literally no true development out there. The land use designation for that area shows very low intensity, either open space in part of the map, and I'm going to swap maps out right now. Along the creek bed for the creek, we have open space shown. That is a buffer area that's intended to help protect that. There's partially watershed, partially flood control, partially buffer between any other development and the airport itself. And then adjacent to that and to the east is very low-density residential.
George, question.
Sure.
You're talking about that being colored on the general map as open space. Is it in private holdings now?
It is.
Do they know that it's been designated as open space?
Yes. They participated in that process some years ago. Pre-planning for annexation for that area involved land use designation.
I just want to make sure that the things we're putting on map is not a shell shock to somebody when they look at it.
The current owner is different owner now than was in place at the time we originally designated that on the 2003 land use map. That the current owner proposes to make some modifications to that. Some of it includes a little bit higher intensity residential. Our districts, for purposes of the general plan, are extremely broad. There's low density residential that would account for 3 of our land use designation, or 3 of our zoning districts, excuse me, in LDC designations. But the other areas are much broader. They would cover almost all of our residential uses if you apply particular zoning to it. It allows you a lot of flexibility when the actual property comes to the city and needs zoning put in place. What they're proposing in changes would account for some change to commercial along here, going to an industrial, especially right at the end of the runway. This area in particular, and then this area just south of our wastewater treatment plant. Those 2 areas, because of close proximity to the airport, would not be conducive to any kind of residential development. And the designation that was previously in place implied that it could be more combination of retail, commercial, as well as industrial type development. And they want to specifically call them out for industrial development. One of the benefits of that, especially in this area, is the lack of adverse impacts of airport noise on industrial. You tend to have very few adverse impacts associated with airport operations.
Is that part of the purple, part of what they're talking about changing?
The purple is what they're proposing to change along here. And then this designation would be a slightly different residential development.
So that is that airport zone that goes into the purple, is that the proposed extension of the runway?
That's an area that would allow for a proposed extension of the runway.
And have we been in negotiation with the property owner to see if we can do a trade-off or some value trading to make sure the city is protected with its airport, plus to be able to possibly get it reduced in cost?
We've had that area designated for something like that for a number of years since the adoption of the airport-specific area plan in 2001.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, Mayor.
Go right ahead, then I have one, yeah.
If we switch it to industrial, then we go to buy it, is now the land worth more because it's zoned differently?
That's actually an interesting question, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that.
I can maybe throw in a little bit on it. I think when you get an appraisal of a large parcel, the appraiser is going to look at what he believes is highest and best use. So the actual zoning has some play or some effect on the appraisal value, but the appraiser will still look at what may be highest and best use. So it doesn't directly control it. And obviously, you know, if it's an arm's length deal, it's going to be what the parties want to buy and sell. If it's condemnation, it's a little different. But appraisers are going to look at both of those issues. So if highest and best use is industrial, it may get appraised that way and affect the value. But it doesn't really, the land use plan doesn't necessarily drive that decision.
And sorry, just a follow-up question to that. By going with the plan alternative, if we're not rezoning anything. We're only laying out what the mapping allows for the future.
It would allow for a rezoning. I don't even know what this current zoning is at this point, but it would allow for a rezoning consistent with the general plan versus if there was an attempt to, if this were to remain, I think, mixed use under the current map, or current proposed map, to put in, say, industrial, would require, I guess, a minor plan amendment at the same time, so you'd have to do sort of 2 votes on it.
And also, if I'm not mistaken, the piece that is the sewer treatment plant, there's a large odor easement protruding into this area. So, likely industrial is what would be appropriate anyways.
There's an odor easement, and then there's actually a fee parcel we own, subject to some some royalty rights for, I think, sand and gravel mining.
Okay.
Yeah. George, my question, looking at the open space, the green, or proposed open space possibly, is that a broad brush approach, or is that a FEMA line that we're following, or where do we get that from?
It's sort of a combination of both of those things. The original intent was to follow water courses with open space areas to protect the water course itself for several reasons. One is because FEMA protects some of these. This one in particular has a considerable flood plain and floodway associated with it. So the intent was to try and identify that as open space areas to discourage anyone attempting to build too close to them. It is something that's available and possible to amend depending upon a number of steps. One would be to amend the FEMA maps in the area, and then to amend the land use and zoning designation of the area to allow for that development to occur closer to the creek bed. One of the benefits of this area is that it's so wide open, it's probably not likely or necessary for someone to crowd in closer to the actual the creek itself, the wash. There's so much area adjacent to that that may be more buildable and better buildable lands that it's likely that that's probably going to be left that way, even through an annexation and rezoning process. However, as the city attorney mentioned, at the time the city were to annex property, you have to designate zoning, and that is an interactive process. The developer comes to you and says, here's what I want for zoning, and you say, well, here's what we think is appropriate for zoning, and that's what you said at the time of the annexation. So you annex it in, comes in with county zoning, you immediately rezone in almost all cases to something that's appropriate to the land use map.
I think where I was coming from there, the down closer to town, there's some consideration being given to channelization that would narrow what the existing channel is considerably, and creating more usable land for other purposes. And if that same thing happened as we move to the north, is it easily amendable? Because that's a large piece of property.
It is
in the green.
And the answer is yes. It's something that can be amended through a minor land use map amendment that could occur at the time of zoning or at the time of annexation.
Okay, so it would be a minor amendment then?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, anyone else?
I'd like to go off on a whole separate kind of topic on this, and you could cut me off, Mayor, if you think I'm going too sideways on this one. But as I was driving up to Flagstaff this weekend, I was pointing out where the hospital is going to be, and I'm looking at this general plan regional jurisdictions, and it shows our checkerboard, and it really does look like we're going to close up 89. I mean, we just keep coming, and as there's improvements and more roundabouts, we're going to really shut this down. And does Game and Fish have any plan for what is the future of the pronghorn in the area? And you know, when they have these, because you can see the checkerboard of state land, private land, it's going to develop unless, you know, we buy up a whole bunch of it or something, which I'm not in for doing. But when we talk about the wildlife corridors that Mr. Warab's brought up, do they have a plan on what happens to the herds that we have, or are we just going to basically cut them off and make them extinct? Because yeah, I know, you know, it's private land. You have your right to sell it. I'd want the right to sell it, do whatever, and develop mine. Do they have a plan of what to do with the herds that are on both sides of that road?
They provided the city through both the General Plan Committee and at the Planning and Zoning Commission some language to incorporate into the plan that encourages wildlife corridor connectivity. And in fact, we have that in the plan. That was something that was approved and adopted by the both the committee before sending it to Planning Commission and then Planning Commission before sending it to you. So there's some language encouraging connectivity of open space, and that's something that occurs on a case-by-case basis as you get a subdivision proposal. We do have the land use designations that are shown as open space, the green on this map, to provide some areas where the connectivity can occur. These are areas that are not conducive to development for some reason, primarily because they're washes or in some cases hilltops or ridge lines. Those areas are identified on the general land use map. We don't have a map that specifically includes or encourages wildlife corridor connectivity. We do have text that does that. The problem that can occur, and we show this to some degree on the jurisdictions map, all of those blue boxes all over the map are under the control of the state land department. And their primary purpose is to sell those properties to raise money for Arizona schools. So they behave like and are treated by most municipalities as a developer. So they have competing requirements. They may be in competition with their adjacent property owners and with other state agencies like Fish and Game, or Game and Fish. Their intent is to try to develop those properties at their highest and best use, because their job is to make more money off of the sale of those properties or lease of those properties for the state school system. So what we've tried to do is to accommodate both of those competing aims. We show the open areas, the open spaces on the land use map as potential areas for connectivity for wildlife. Those areas typically don't interfere with the state land department's plans. They've acknowledged them in their development plans. And we've also provided text in the document that promotes council working with the local developer when they bring us a subdivision plat to make sure that not just trails connectivity is an issue, but also wildlife corridors are something that's part of the discussion.
I just know in the, I think it was late 60s, early 70s, up at Sedona, the Forest Service worked with Sedona to do a bunch of land swaps, and basically it kept Sedona here and left all the beautiful nature that's around there on the outside. I can't imagine if it was checkerboard what Sedona would look like still today. And I didn't know if was there any plan to do something similar to this area, because with the checkerboarding, it really doesn't seem to make sense. You think they'd want to move those, maybe do some swaps where it works out better for everybody.
At this point in time, I'm not aware of anything like that. One of the things that is also in place at this point in time is a lot of those areas are far from other development. They're controlled under ranching leases to the adjacent properties.
Yes.
But as development pressures occur, that may be a time when something like that would be necessary and would occur with both the Game and Fish and the State Land Department working together.
Thank you for entertaining my left-hand turn. Thank you, guys.
Jim?
Thank you, Mayor. George, as we're speaking today, this is a general plan. Of course, it's subject to change. It always is subject to change. You know, a plan's just a plan. And, you know, there are provisions in Growing Smarter for major plan amendments and minor plan amendments. And let's keep in mind, we also have for properties that are not in the city, we're subject to Prop 400. We're also subject to cost-benefit analysis for different things. So here again, that's things that you look at when you get into the specific plan and you go a little bit farther than a general plan. And in general, this is what we're looking at down the road for the next 4 or 5 years. And this council, the body, has an opportunity at any time to entertain doing another general plan if things change in a way that would be conducive to us asking the public, hey, something changed in our lives and we're going to do this differently for the next 4 or 5 years. So just sharing with you, it's a general plan. A lot of what we're talking about seems to be more specific, but in a general plan, it's more or less just kind of general. So.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay. Okay, George.
So there are two areas within Arizona Eco Development's proposal that come up. There's the northern area I just talked about, and then there's a southern area that's down in the Dells, where they're proposing a change from open space to a mixed-use designation for part of the property, and then a slight change in the residential designation for some of the property. And again, we have a representative here from them, Jason Giese, who can talk to you in more specifics about that, and perhaps should talk to you in more specifics about that before you take any action on this proposal. The third proposal is a relatively minor change. This area is under the control of Deepwell Ranches. This area was one of those places that was originally under the 2003 plan placed under a ranching holding pattern land use designation, because at that time there were no specifics and no options for development proposed by the property owner. They've since come back to us and said, we would like to see this designated as low-density residential development so that when they come to us for an annexation in the future, that it will already have a land use in place.
And let me further comment that the pre-annexation agreement that was entered into between the city and Deepwell Ranch includes this area. So this is not another area that has not been discussed before. This is included within the boundary of that pre-annexation agreement.
I think it's important to acknowledge Mr. Blair's concerns that the property owners of these lands have been included in the conversations. We're just not out there planning what to do with somebody else's land. So I think that's important.
Lindsay, you want to speak to this?
I wanted to have a comment to Councilman Kuknio's discussion of the checkerboard. Quick comment. State Land Trust land, the checkerboard stuff, they do not have the authority under state statute to engage in a land swap. Their mandate, which is in the Constitution, requires them to sell land at the highest and best use and to get the most money possible. About a dozen years ago, there was legislation passed that set aside money from the lottery funds, about $20 million a year for, I don't remember the exact name of it, but it was state land preservation stuff. And part of that was also to allow a conservation designation on that property.
Right.
That's all gone. So the only authority that the State Land Trust currently has under the state constitution is to sell the land for the best price at the highest and best use. They can't swap it. They can't put a conservation easement on it, which would bring the, depress the price for a developer or whatever. But they don't have that authority anymore.
Well, don't they have the ability to lease? I know in the Scottsdale area, they're leasing some land long-term. And I also understand that they can sell a conservation easement.
I don't think that's available anymore. And some of the stuff that happened in Scottsdale was under that program, that state land preservation program, that was only in existence for about 4 or 5 years, because the money that was spent out of that $20 million that was supposedly set aside for several years from lottery funds was spent in Maricopa County, and some of it did go into Scottsdale. The city, with local land preservation groups like the Open Space Alliance, applied for those conservation easements for Glassford Hill,
Right.
and in partnership with Prescott Valley,
Right.
and
P
for
Mountain.
P
Yep.
Mountain. But those designations expired after 5 years. So those designations haven't been in place or available for like 7 or 8 years now.
Yeah.
So-
Well, state land is still leasing the antenna sites for the radio stations on P Mountain. So they still have the ability to lease property that has income producing, is what I've been told. But George, that's something we might follow up on.
Yeah, and I believe the state land can lease for commercial purposes, so if they've designated it for
Yeah.
commercial purposes, they can lease to a commercial. It is a long-term lease. If it's to go to any residential use, it's a sale only.
Yeah. Okay, good, thank you. Craig, a quick question. We haven't adopted this yet, and we do have the new road alignment in place for the Deepwell Ranch, the bypass road. Wouldn't it be appropriate to identify that on this land use map? Because it is set in concrete. We'll be bidding on it soon. Is that possible?
Yeah, we can certainly show it on the land use map. We show it on the circulation map as
Yeah.
proposed, but it can certainly
Well,
be shown.
it and the following road to be built someday to the west of it can be very important.
I think it'd be useful to show that. This is a general plan, and this is a planning map, so it should be shown, the latest information, accurate information
Right,
should be
okay.
shown.
So we can do that, okay. Anyone else, sir? Gene?
I just want clarification. In the deep well pre-annexation agreement, there is a water allocation, so there would be water for that low-density residential development, correct?
The pre-annexation agreement has two parts to it. One is it's a pre-annexation agreement. The second part is it's a water settlement agreement. In that document, there are two different things. One is potential annexation. The other is water. However, there is a provision in the pre-annexation agreement that contemplates the use of the water, which is being provided or was provided according to that settlement, the use of that water within the boundaries of the pre-annexation agreement. So effectively, the pre-annexation agreement comes with water, settlement water, which is intended by both parties to be used within the boundaries.
Okay.
Okay.
We do have the representative from Arizona Eco Development, and you may benefit from having him talk to you for just a moment. So if it's acceptable to council, we'll invite Jason Giese to come up and maybe give a synopsis of what his changes are.
And this is appropriate time as far as
Yes,
you're
sir.
concerned? Okay.
I think he just left the room. Oh, step up here.
Did you contemplate speaking?
Mayor, I'm happy to talk to you and answer any questions you'd like, and if I don't need to answer any, I'm okay with that too.
Questions? Why don't you give us an overview,
Sure.
Jason, and then maybe that'll develop a question or two.
Probably need to check in officially. Jason Giese, Representative Arizona Eco Development, 3200 Lakeside Village Drive. Mayor, basically, Councilman Lamerson hit the nail on the head from my perspective. The general plan sets out a course of potential zoning districts that will be formalized at a later date in conjunction with an annexation and rezone request. And so the mapping that you guys have on the screen above there is simply a nip tuck from my perspective. We're adding some density to the residential piece to the north of the interchange. Having said that, we have to sort out the water in order to be able to develop a subdivision there, residential subdivision. And we'll get into much more specific land use by area as we move forward with a Prop 400 annexation. I'm going to anticipate by the time the third-party studies are done, it'll be the fall of the year before that formal submittal gets made. And then we'll go through the Prop 400 process, which is quite exhaustive, and lots of questions will be asked and answered as we move forward. So from my perspective, we're simply setting the table for the future submittals that will come before the city of Prescott.
Okay, now any questions? Gene, your turn.
Oh, boy. Okay. To be blunt, at first blush, this looked like you were asking for increase in density pretty much over all of the properties. So it seems like you're asking the city to give the landowner a benefit now without having gone through the committee process and all that. So two parts to that question. What benefit will the city gain in return for seeing an increase in density of development here? And two, why does this come now before the council instead of having gone through the committee process?
Sure. So simply from a timing perspective, as we move through what was a foreclosure, bankruptcy, eventually we secured title to the property via the federal bankruptcy court. There was a very long period of time where the title of the land was not held in Arizona Eco's name. There was a considerable fight over that title. At the end of the day, Arizona Eco was awarded the title via federal bankruptcy court, and so from a timing perspective, we were able to get possession of the property, start preliminarily planning, and then we made a informal presentation to staff, and the question was asked, would you like to try to amend the general plan so you wouldn't have to go through a major plan amendment in the future? The answer was certainly yes. Minor plan amendments are much easier. We don't need to wait until state mandated election periods. We can move through the process with the city of Prescott in, I'll call it a normal flow. It's not artificial. As it relates to the benefit to the city, the benefits to the city don't get described at this level of planning. You know, we're at 30,000 feet at present. And so as we move forward through the process and we start to talk about things like open space, there will be clear and significant benefit to the city of Prescott, but it's not for this level of planning to designate and identify those opportunities and challenges, frankly. So there'll be plenty of give and take between the private party, Arizona Eco Development, and the city as we move forward into the future. And I believe that the answer to your question will then become apparent. Having said that, a good agreement probably has us both grinding our molars as we shake hands. It's always a bit contentious when we work through that development agreement process, and the various definitions of what the benefit to the city might become for different constituents, people, and groups.
Time for another question?
That it?
Well, you did mention there would be a future annexation request.
Absolutely.
Right. And at that point, we would sit down and do a pre-annexation agreement.
You know, I don't know if we're going to, would it be a pre-annexation agreement? Okay. So the answer would be yes. And I guess the main reason that it would be pre-annexation in my mind is that the southern property in particular enjoys its own water right. And so as a result, the property will need to be annexed and rezoned into the city of Prescott before we can execute on the last piece of the sever and transfer application, whereby Arizona Eco actually severs the water from the land that we own and transfers it to the city of Prescott's water portfolio. And so we'll need, the property will have to have been successfully annexed, rezoned, and the vesting period for any referendum will have had to have expired before we can let that water go, because the water is obviously a very a valuable asset that the land enjoys and the company owns, and paid quite a bit of money in order to own that.
So one benefit there is you're bringing water into the city that we wouldn't otherwise have.
Arizona Eco has a couple different opportunities as it relates to water. One is a historic water right that dates back to 1881. It's a 375 acre-foot water right. The water today is impounded in Watson Lake. Probably starting here in April, we'll call for that water and we'll start irrigating our fields. That beneficial use has been demonstrated for, well, like I said, since 1881. And SRP, after approximately 14 months, has finally said in writing, we're not going to contest. We understand that you have a very good water right on Granite Creek. SRP doesn't say things like they support us, but they're not going to contest our water right. In addition, Arizona Eco has been purchasing extinguishment credits. So we've been building our own water bank outside and in addition to the historical irrigation right on Granite Creek. And so the answer to your question is yes, Arizona Eco has a substantial amount of water, approximately 475 acre feet as we sit here today, as long as the 375 holds up through the certification process, which we expect that it will. And in addition, we're working on acquisition of another approximately 100 acre feet currently. And so we believe that we will bring one heck of an asset into the city of Prescott. The terms and conditions under which will certainly be described in a development agreement to benefit both parties.
One thing I really like about the annexation of this large parcel is that it will increase the connectivity between the airport and central part of Prescott. We have a big hole in there right now that would be nice to close and be part of Prescott, because it is Prescott.
Couldn't agree more. And in addition, I read the general plan this morning. There's lots of talk about protecting the airport into the future. And so now we would, by accomplishing specifically the northern leg of the annexation, Gene, we I guess complete, I think, the picture of Prescott on the northeast side of town for my lifetime is my expectation. And in addition to that, we create a real nice buffer and opportunities to grow businesses, hopefully, in and around the airport area. That will also grow houses, and that will grow retail sales tax revenue. So I believe that from a holistic perspective, it's very rare that we get to deal with a piece of land this large in a master plan setting, and I think that it'll be a positive step forward for the city of Prescott in the future on multiple fronts.
Quick question, George or Jason. The extension of the P-Vine on the land use general plan, there's been conversation from time to time of maybe a realignment north of 89A to get it to the westerly so it would not split that land parcel in the middle. Is that still a minor plan amendment if that should ever happen?
Yes, that would probably be something that's negotiated through a pre-annexation agreement and would be designated as part of any subdivision plats that follow annexation.
Yeah. Legal. Any of Gene's comments of making the changes on the general map have any legal effect, or it doesn't appear to me that it's shortening the process at all?
Well, I think that, you know, as has been mentioned a number of times, general plan is intended to be a general plan. There are two, or in this case, probably three significant legislative steps. One would be a pre-annexation agreement that would sort of lay out the proposed zoning, all of the water rights exchanges, all of the dedicated open space, all those things. That would all be contingent upon a successful annexation, as well as then which is a legislative act, and then a successful rezoning, which is also a legislative act, and then the running of the 30 days referendum period before it all takes effect. If one of those steps doesn't occur, then the terms of the development agreement would state that by its own terms it would become void, and the property, and none of those conditions or agreements would take place, and the property would still be in the county. So there are a number of significant legislative steps subject to referendum, and certainly discretionary with the city council at the time to enter into or not. So this general plan, if the council chooses to change the land use map designations, it doesn't bind the city to do anything. And in fact, you know, sort of remind that the map is one page of a 80 or 100 page document. So all of the other general plan elements that would apply to this would still apply. So a map is just a page of a bigger, broader plan that has a lot of other things like open space, wildlife corridors, connectivity, and transportation, and all those other elements, water, all those other elements and factors that come into play.
Okay. You have anything further?
No, sir. Thank you.
You got off easy, didn't you?
Oh, my day's coming.
Wait till he gets to the...
It'll be a long road.
Thank you, Mr. Giese. Yes, sir. Come on down.
Yes, my name is Chuck McVeigh. I'm a resident of Prescott, area code 301. I confess I know I am jumping in the middle of at the end of a conversation that involves parcels that I don't know how they're being set up. But what I believe I'm hearing as a member of the audience here is an increasing density around the airport. that I've seen happen in Southern California. You're seeing it in Santa Monica right now, where they want to shut down that airport. We saw it in Huntington Beach with Meadowlark Airport, which was shut down because of the increasing density, and developers came up in front of the city council like this and said, it's not safe anymore, we should develop that land. So I don't see, again, at the end of this conversation that you all have been having that I've not been a part of, I'm seeing that increasing density beginning here and continuing. I also don't see in the plan, George, in that purple area, a recognition that we need to increase the airport length, not only for commercial flights, but for firefighting activities where the big tankers need to land in the future. And that's all I wanted to put in front of the council. I think those are things we need to consider. Thank you.
Well, we'll make you aware the just in the last several months, the council has approved some long-range opportunities at the airport. Initially, we were looking at the land around the airport and discovered that until we settle the airport area itself, that we could do very little with the land around the airport to protect it and also protect the airport from it.
I have read those discussions, but I just don't see that in the general planning that we're doing now.
Yeah, well, whether it's in the general plan or not, the work has been done, and maybe that's something that we should inject a statement into the general plan. Yeah.
Well, I think George would probably comment that there is also an airport-specific plan which addresses the gentleman's concerns.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
But I think he's right, Mayor. You know, people build next to an airport and then complain about the noise. You know, you build in the middle of the forest and then worry about the fire danger after that. There's some personal accountability to when you build to places like that. As Prescott grows, that airport's going to grow. Planes are going to get bigger. They are going to come in. So I think, I know it doesn't work out a lot of times. Later on, people complain about that, but that is the way it is.
Okay.
As the city manager alluded to, the airport-specific area plan did take a lot of that potential into account when it was developed, and its land uses are reflected on this map with the exceptions of those changes that have occurred recently. So one of the things that we looked at was designating a fairly large area, and this was with the owner at the time, with their acquiescence, if not encouragement. A large area of open space up here, which is directly in line with the runways, would allow for extension of the runway at some point in the future, and would also buffer and protect the airport from the development that can occur a little further east, these areas, which are shown for residential uses. Okay. So we've provided some buffer both on this plan and in the airport-specific area plan.
Okay. Okay.
If you have no other questions about these particular topics, we do ask you to open the public hearing, allow it for any additional public comment, and continue that hearing on to the 14th for your final public hearing and possible adoption of the plan.
Okay.
Thank you.
Even though we've had some discussion already, let's open to the public any input concerning where we are at this moment. Anyone from the public? George? Or
Daniel.
No. Go ahead. Dan, I'm sorry.
My name's Daniel Matson. I live over on Merritt Street. I just wanted to real quick mention, when it comes to form-based codes, the committee did have significant discussion about that, and if my memory serves me right, it was decided that the planned area development would allow for essentially the same thing. And so that's why we didn't, in fact, we said, let's remove references to form-based code. So if you put back in references to form-based code, you're just counteracting the wishes of the committee on that. We were trying to shorten the document. I felt it was redundant because the planned area development allowed for essentially the same thing. So, and then on the housing authority, I've worked somewhat with that group, and our desire is not to have the government do it, but we do want the government to be cooperative at the time that we set forth to form the 501c3 that would eventually become the housing authority for the county. So putting in the language that was suggested, I totally agree with. I've looked over all of the changes, all the strike-throughs, all the additions, and I think we have a pretty well-refined plan that should be approved essentially as it is. Thank you.
Dan, thank you. Probably an appropriate time to thank you for the hours that you spent working with the general plan, so thank you for that. Yeah. Also acknowledge Ms. Ruffner. Be a good time. Do you have anything further, Elizabeth, that you'd like to have? Okay, well, thank you. Leslie and Chris? Okay.
Good morning. Leslie Hoy, Prescott. I have a couple of questions, and then I have something else that I don't know how to describe it. So, do I have a few minutes?
Yes, you have.
Okay. First of all, sitting in the audience as a citizen, sometimes I feel like David and Goliath, and I'm not Goliath. When someone like Jason comes forward at the last minute with his map, and I know all the interests of the people that are on the council, that just makes me feel even a little bit smaller. But as you know, I don't go away, so here I am. So a question I would have about that map would be, I think it's important to know, even though it's just a plan, but I've seen the plan, the general plan, used as an excuse by all sides when things come forward and have to be acted on. What the impact is on the water allocation and also water use and safe yield. And I hear Jason saying he's getting water from all over the place, but probably that water's coming from the little Chino. So I would just ask that before you incorporate the map, that there's some more thinking done about this. I don't know how, I mean, is this the first time that you're seeing the map, or have you all seen it previously?
Okay.
So I'm just asking you to take into consideration the impact on water. And of course, if we're increasing density in population, that has impacts on the community in a lot of other ways too. But when it becomes a Prop 400 annexation, hopefully there'll be a cost-benefit study done. Okay. Then on page 71, it's section 9.2.2 under there, strategy 1.2. Before I got here today, I just wanted an explanation of the edit there. But now I'm wondering if this edit had anything to do with the Arizona Eco Zoning Industrial Development that's close to Granite Creek. Okay. And then can someone just say why we changed the language? And who did the edit?
Leslie, I can comment to that. I brought this up last meeting specifically, and was looking at it from the word discourage. I didn't want somebody who's reading a plan from wherever to say they're discouraging industrial development. I wanted it to be enough to say we are concerned about this and it's something we need to evaluate, but I want to ensure that we're not sending the wrong message to somebody, that while watershed protection and pollution runoff is important and a top priority, the way the language was set, and if you go back and listen to the video, my comments then are about the same as now. I wanted something that wasn't discourage, I wanted evaluate, because there's ways to evaluate and address runoff issues.
Okay, and I agree about what you said, except for this isn't clear. This makes it seem that we're it could be read that we're evaluating the industrial discharges that have already occurred. So I think it just needs to be fixed. So maybe we could just say evaluate potential industrial discharges.
I would have no problem adding that.
Or instead of potential or future, maybe something to that effect?
Well, it should be clear that we're going to evaluate them before industry moves in and makes the discharges, and then later we're evaluating them.
You bet.
Okay, thanks. Then on page 82, last time under strategy 3.4, okay. Last time I expressed my dismay, disappointment, and discouragement at the fact that you took out the word habitat. And that's what happened. However, when I read this over again, on page 69, under strategy 3.2, it says maintain conservation of habitats and ecosystems within existing open space, including the lakes. Therefore, you have it there. And just a minute. On page 72, under strategy 2.1, it says explore ways to balance human uses with flora and fauna at man-made reservoirs. So it's actually in here in a couple other places already, so I'm asking that under strategy 3.4 on page 82 you return the word habitat that was put there by the General Plan Committee.
What was the other page that you were referencing?
There's 82, 69, and 72.
69.
I think. Yeah. So you've got habitat in there 2 other places already.
I think, Mayor, if I can, I'll throw in, and maybe George can also participate. I think the goals and strategies are geared to the particular section. So the first section is open space that she referred to on page 69. Page 72 is environmental planning. This section is water resource. So I think that the goals and strategies in the plan are geared to different sections of open space, environmental planning, and water. And so I think as I recall, the water strategy deals specifically with water quality, water resources, and I know there was, I think it was last time, the debate about the purchase of the lakes specifically was for these 2 things versus the open space goals and strategies and the environmental planning goals and strategies have sort of a different goal. That's a redundant, a different purpose in mind. So sometimes, you know, when it's not uncommon for a general plan sections to have some tension between the various parts and pieces of the plan. And ultimately, when decisions are made, this sort of goes back to the other questions about when there's a pre-annexation agreement, a rezoning, and an annexation, sometimes the decisions are, you have to, for lack of a better term, pick and choose which are the more important or most important of the plan elements that you're going to focus on in terms of looking at what the benefits are and what the costs are, because it's not always going to be necessarily consistent. There may be tension between different parts. The open space, certainly there's a tension between open space and environmental planning and economic development at times. So as policymakers, council makes those decisions sometimes and has to pick and choose and balance between what the priorities are going to be. So I think that's why there are some differences, I think, in the plan at this point, because they're coming out of different focuses or different emphasis in the plan.
Mr. Mayor, the strategies also are particular to the particular goals that you're looking at. So in this particular case, you're seeing augment city water supplies. So the focus is very much on augmenting the city water supply. not the competition for water between recreational uses and augmenting those supplies and habitat. That
But
is covered by those other sections.
The recreational is,
It has specifically to do with the volume of water in the lakes associated with recreation.
okay, but the birds and the trees also depend on the, on the level of water. And to address Mr. Palladini's point, it's those tensions that provide work for attorneys. And aren't we in our plan trying to have something that's consistent? I didn't really, yeah. Anyway, I'm an editor, so I see these things. And I can't help pointing out that you've got, you know, a conflict in here. It doesn't, and so do with it what you will, but if it were me, I would just stick the word habitat back in there and be done with it. Thank you.
Leslie, just a follow-up comment, because I agree there's competing language within the plan, but under the water resources goal, the one thing that we have to take into consideration is the obligation to SRP related to the water. That we have to meet that no matter what, and there's not much that we can do besides having to meet that in a worst-case scenario. And so we want to balance all of these different things, but at the same time, we have the legal obligation to meet our requirements with them. And so it being general enough to talk about it, and ultimately a specific lake management plan, which in my opinion is part of the TMDL, is what needs to happen anyways, I think can be addressing these specific issues.
And I think a lot of that came out of that, I mean, you got to go back in time and look at this one, because before we bought the lakes, they'd fill up, and every year Chino Valley would drain them almost down to nothing every single year that it would go. That was a big debate on if we bought the lakes, then we could leave them full for recreational purposes. And maybe it didn't say that. I don't remember what the exact language in the proposition of the people was, but it was definitely sold as we can use this as recreation. Now, as that happened and the lake started staying full, then we started having these habitats kind of develop in those trees where those birds would lay their eggs and everything, and then we'd start draining some of that lake because of our obligations. Then the coyotes would get over to where they could now had a land bridge over to where the habitat was, and then they'd eat the eggs and stuff, right? Which is where this is all coming out of?
I don't know.
Well, yeah, I know definitely on Willow Lake it was.
In nature, things eat other things. I know that.
Right. So I see this, though, with I think this was just answering that question from the voters was, yeah, we have all this lakes, and yes, we need this for our water supply, but we're selling it to you as recreation, so we can't drain these. And I think this specific strategy just addresses that specific question that was in there, and that's why it's in this section.
Okay, well, sometime in the future, somebody's going to come before you and point out that when you destroy the habitat at the lake, that in 2 other places in the general plan it said that you were interested in fostering the habitat. So,
can we just add? Can we add one sentence that we didn't all agree on everything?
Sure. Thank you.
Jim, you want to comment on that?
No, I want to move on.
Okay. Thanks, Leslie. Appreciate it.
I believe
anyone else?
Under economic development, we added a goal and strategy to discourage employment of attorneys. I got that out of the comments.
Just for the record, I don't need the additional work. I got plenty.
Okay. Anyone else? George, you were through the whole process. Any comments?
No. Just on that habitat issue, you know, we had complaints about dog feces around town and things like that, and that is a problem in terms of the water supply here is having that bird habitat. It doesn't help the TDML in any way, so I think we should leave that out here.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I see a lady that we don't see very often. Good to see you.
Hi, Mr. Mayor and Council. Dava Hoffman with Dava and Associates. I just want to say that I think this is the most studied general plan and the longest process I have ever seen, and I've done general plans all over the state. I think it is so thoroughly looked at that it is an excellent document. The committee worked very hard on it for 3 or 4 years, the staff, you know, you have an excellent staff in the Community Development Department, Planning Manager, City Manager, and City Attorney. I mean, they know their stuff inside and out, so they're giving you the best recommendations and advice. And like I said, the committee, the Planning Commission, and now the council has taken all this time to go through it page by page. It's remarkable, and I think it is a great representation of true democracy when we go through a plan this way. And keep in mind that it is a living document. General plans can be amended at any time. So it doesn't have to be letter perfect every time, and there is no such thing as a perfect plan. So just keep that in mind, but I just congratulate the city for the long process and the thoroughness of what you've done. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. One more bite at the apple.
Always, always. I've never been accused of not saying enough. I would just raise a couple of comments to the recent discussion. The land use map, this is a general plan, but the land use map that you guys were just discussing is the only part of the 140 or so pages that does have the effective law. So that one piece definitely has the effective law, whereas the rest of the document, the strategies and goals and so forth, are broad and guidance, policy guidance. So it's wise to keep that in mind as you decide whether you're going to make some changes to the land use map. And in terms of Watson and Willow Lakes, you're absolutely right. It was sold to the voters on the basis of a recreational amenity, and there was plans for a certain level of conservation pool that would maintain that recreation amenity, and that was absolutely part of the proposition that went to the voters and that the voters approved by a 2-to-1 margin. I was there.
And they even set up a committee afterwards to explore a 10-year plan, I think it was.
Yes, yes. As the master plan and the council that I was on at the time, we did put under contract a firm out of Phoenix to do the master plan, and you know, most of that has been implemented along the way, but all of that took place within a few months subsequent to the passage of the proposition. So
it was 4 months, and I was that committee's Daniel. I was at every meeting.
And we appreciated it because it's a great opportunity for the city, and it was a once in a lifetime chance to bring an amenity into the city and have that under the conservation and protection of the city. So it was a fabulous thing that we did. But it was for recreational purposes and secondarily for the water rights. And there's continue to be, as part of the deal, there continue to be the grandfathered rights that will become extinguished over time. But the Chino Valley Irrigation District users still have those rights, and SRP is one of those folks that has some rights to that water as well. Okay, we're nearing the end of what has been a very long journey, and I would like to echo Deva's comments and commend the committee, the Planning and Zoning Commission, and the council for very thoroughly vetting the plan, taking comment, considering suggestions, and I was certainly one of the people that came to all of those groups and brought some comments to the forefront. And I personally appreciate the fact that the committee, Planning and Zoning, and the council have thoughtfully considered what I brought forward and what other citizens have brought forward. And we're getting close to being able to turn it over to the voters to ratify at a election this year. So that's a good thing. I want to let you know that the Good Governance Committee, of which I'm a member, has been facilitating some discussions of a broader concept that we refer to as the Prescott We Want, which talks about all of the various things that the community envisions into the future. And we're asking people to look at the Prescott General Plan, the proposed general plan, and vet it to determine whether it represents this broader concept of the desired future that we, as a collective community, see for the community in the future. We've had 3 of those discussions so far, and we're willing to take that discussion and facilitate a dialogue about the general plan to whatever groups want to have that discussion. We've got another one set up. We're meeting with the American Association of University Women at their May meeting. We just met this past week with the Prescott Young Professionals, so we're willing to do more of that because we think it's really important that the voters understand what's in the general plan, that they can make an informed decision about ratifying it. And so we're trying to do our part to facilitate that discussion. Part of doing that is that Good Governance has actually spun off a second registered political action committee that I chair, which is for the purpose of promoting ratification of the general plan. So just to let you know that we've done that. And we've already produced a 2-page summary of the general plan that we've been using in some of these discussions, and we're happy to work with city staff to make sure that the documents that we're using are accurate and reflective of the general plan. We think they are, but things can always be tweaked and refined a little bit. So we offer ourselves to work with the city as we go forward and have the voters look that over and vet it to make an informed decision. I'm assuming, of course, I'm always an optimist that the voters will approve the general plan, and then the real work begins afterwards. You all have talked a lot about convening a strategic plan to help you with the details of implementing the general plan, and that's a great idea, which I definitely applaud. But remember that a strategic plan is a little bit more than an implementation plan. It involves prioritizing everything that's in the general plan. All of those goals and strategies are all important, but some of them need to be worked on first. So that's a piece that you need to consider as you convene the Strategic Planning Committee. What are the most critical things that we need to address first in terms of implementing the various goals and strategies out of the general plan? So it's just not an implementation plan. It is truly a strategic plan that looks at what are the challenges, what are the forces coming at the city that suggests that we need to address certain elements first and certain strategies first, certain goals first. So just keep that in mind as you move beyond the ratification and convene the Strategic Planning Committee to help you flesh out the goals and strategies and help you decide what to address and tackle first and set out a time frame for doing that, because there are some things, water possibly, some of the other issues that will come to the forefront as being the most critical to be addressed sooner rather than later. So with that, I appreciate all the work that you've done and all the time that the community, Planning and Zoning Council, and the General Plan Committee have taken to produce the document and get us this far. Time to turn it over to the voters. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll close the public hearing, our portion on the general plan as of today, and we will reopen on the 14th for more public input. So that said, anything else?
I just want to clarify, George, next week on our council agenda, will we be set for making a decision to adopt the plan?
That's our understanding. So you will have a public hearing, subject to any changes that may occur out of public comment.
Okay.
You will recommend a motion and adopt the general plan and set it for going to the voters.
And if there are any changes, it would be subject to those changes.
So if you adopt subject to those changes, we will ensure that the final document is corrected and ready to be put out for the public review.
Thanks for being here. We're adjourned.